Hey, today I'm going to show you some essential tips on how to start rendering if you're first or a beginner. I'm going to show you some essential rules you've got to follow to get started. So first off, try and avoid working in direct sunlight. I've got the sun hitting me here, but if you can, if you're a beginner, work in the shade, work when it's a bit cloudy and you're not expecting any rain. But avoid working where the sun's directly hitting the wall, because it'll just drain the moisture out of the render. And if you're not equipped and if you're not prepared, it'll just mess you up. But another tip, this is a scratch coat. It's been applied, it's already dried. If you want a video on how to apply a scratch coat, by the way, should be somewhere around here. But the first thing you've got to do is make sure that that wall has got enough moisture. So we've got to really spray it down and get it prepared for your top coat. So this is just a portable little pressure sprayer. What we're doing is just putting a nice layer of moisture to the render, and this will stop the top coat from drying out too fast. So make sure you add this. I've done this wrong before myself. I did a video on it and it does go horribly wrong if you don't moisten it up first. So what I do is give it a decent spray before I start mixing. See how it sets. If it's dried out again, spray it again before you start rendering. But just give it a decent coating. What you don't want to do is apply the render when you can see the water sitting on top. You can see the water sitting in the grooves and it's really saturated. This is why we're going to apply the water before we mix the render. So when we apply the top coat, it's not going to be sitting on a bed of water. If it does that, the render will sag and it won't take up. So we want it damp, but we don't want it soaking like that. So we put it on first, then we mix, and then we apply the render. Now another good tip, you don't want to mix it's too sloppy. You want it to hold its own weight, have a bit of substance to it, and you can see that it's got body. That's what you want in a mix. When you're pulling it around, it doesn't sink, leaves a nice trail. So when you're adding your water to your mix, just don't put too much in. It'll just be harder to apply and rule off afterwards. So have a nice mix, one that can pile on itself. And then what we want to do is apply the render. But the next big tip I recommend if you're new is have a section where you can run your rule bead to bead. So let me explain. So you apply your render always right to left, and that way when you're applying it you can work it into itself. But you're using the right bead as a guide. So using that bead as a guide, you've got fitness you can go to. So starting at the bead, now that top section's been applied and ruled, and what we're going to use that as a guide to apply our render to. We get a decent hawkful. Once you've applied your render, don't play with it. You don't want to get it flat with the trowel, you want to get it flat with the ruler, and I'm going to explain that in a second. But when you put it on the wall, let it take up. So don't play with it, don't touch it, just let it stick to that scratch coat. Now we're coming to the other end of the bead. You want to be roughly the same thickness all the way through, but don't worry about that yet. If it's a bit low, if it's a bit high, don't worry. So we've got a section on. I'm going to show you why it's important to have such a small distance bead to bead, which makes it easy. This straight edge will run all the way through from end to end. Now this is the easiest way to learn how to start ruling, because ruling freehand is quite tough. But if you've got a bead end to end, you're guaranteed to get it right. So first off, this is a feather edge. We're going to do initial rule. Rule on an angle. Take away all the high spots. Scrape off the excess. And what we're left with is a straight section of wall. Now we can see there's a low spot. You see that section here? Where a section's not been touched by the rule, you want to apply a bit more render and then rule it back off. So I'll show you that now. There you go, that section of wall now is completely flat. So because you know you're working bead to bead, if your beads are plumb, fitted correctly, that section now is perfect. And that means for the next stage it's going to be a lot easier. That's why it's important to have a bead speed which is shortened, and then your straight edge can get end to end. It just makes the job a lot easier. It takes that stress away from getting your wall flat. By the way, this is half the battle. This is probably the hardest part in rendering, applying and getting it flat from the beginning. The rest after this is fairly simple if you follow these tips. So that's that section ruled off. Now we wait for it to dry. So obviously sun's moved a bit. We're in the shade, which is perfect place to be rendering, by the way. But we've given it a bit of time, we've ruled off, and what you need to do is let the render take up, let it set a little bit. And a big tip is you never want to rule, I mean this is a float by the way, this is the next stage we're going to do, which I'm going to tell you. And the reason you know when to float is if you push your fingers in and it doesn't leave indentation, but you can still move the render and manipulate it into a way that it leaves a texture, and that is a good time to start floating. So what you do is you grab your float. This is a Rafina diamond backed float. It's very thin, it's got quite a large surface area, but what you do is put it flat to the render and then circular motions. What I'm doing is putting quite a lot of pressure behind it, so you do want to push into it. And what I'm doing is I'm closing it in. Can you see now? The rough texture has been replaced by the smooth finish. Now, the big tip is to making sure that you hit it at the right time. That is a perfect time to be doing it if you're pressing in and it's not leaving indentation, but it's still got a bit of bounce to it. It's still a bit soft. It's a perfect time to do it. Don't do it if it's any wetter than that. If you put your fingerprints in and it's leaving an indentation, you're being able to push into the render, leave it for a little bit. But the big tip is don't leave it too long. You don't want your render to be extremely dry when it comes to floating. It just makes life a lot harder and you might lose control of it. If you can put your float on and it allows you to move the render and it allows you to close it up, that's a perfect time. Again, a big test is you can put pressure behind it. So as you can see, that whole section now is quite smooth. There's a low spot here. What the floating does, it takes off any high spots, fills in any low. Now if we left this too long, it wouldn't be floating like that, it'd be dragging. If you leave it too long, the render will dry and it'll just make it quite hard to get a nice finish from it. So that is another big tip. Another tip, on the beads, you can see now what happens when you rule off, it always leaves a low spot. So as you can see with the beads, a good tip is take a bit of render. So it's the same render from before, I've not done anything with it. Take a bit of render, and I always like to run them up the beads with a float and then float into it. See that low spot? Take a bit of render, fill it in. What you don't want on your beads is dips. You can see now where the whole area is quite flat. Take a bit of render, tough mix from before, put it in and then float it up. So the big tip here is just knowing when to hit it and knowing that you can use your render from your bath and you can fill in any low spots. It's very crucial to make sure your wall is dead flat. Our point when rendering is to make sure our wall's flat but also free from any humps or any dips. So fill in the beads and hitting the render at the perfect time. If you do have a section that's a bit wetter, so here, it's a bit wet, it's fine for me, but if you have a section of render when you're floating and it's pulling the render off, just leave it. Just let it take up a bit longer, don't try and force it. If it is a bit wet and it's, like I say, pulling the render off, dragging it off, just leave it. Just let it dry, give it a few more minutes, have a cup of tea. Don't force it. The worst thing you want to be doing is pulling the render off the wall. It'll affect its strength, it'll affect its bond to the scratch coat, and overall make it a weaker product. So don't be scared to wait. And it's a fine line, I know, but the idea is to test it. And if you're able to fill like we were before, where it's filling without creating too much drama and you're leaving a nice finish, then wait for that desired effect. That's what you're looking for. You don't want it too wet and just create problems. So just have a brew and wait. Okay, so the final stage of the process is the sponging type. So this is where you sponge and get the final finish with the render. Now this big tip, do not have a wet sponge. I've said this in all videos, it's still relevant. Get all the water out. Give it a tap. And what I recommend is when you're sponging, you do it twice. You get the first one just to get any imperfections out, and then the second one is the finisher. So hold with the palm of your hand, open hand, don't squeeze it because it crumples up the center. You want your sponge to be completely flat like your float, because it will leave a texture otherwise. So flat sponge, real soft movements. What we're doing is bringing the texture, the sand, to the surface. So what I like to do is go once, and I'm going to clean the sponge, dry it off, and then go second time. But this time a lot softer. We're going to get a nice finish on it. Sponge flat to the render. The softer you do it, the finer the finish. Small circular motions. You see, that's a real fine finish. If you go hard on the sponge, it leaves lines. What I want is a real soft touch, and it leaves a finer grain. You see that? And we'll come to the top where you blend it in. Very soft up there, where we're meeting into the first spot that was sponged. Turn the sponge around, so we've got the clean end flat, and start again. Clean the edges off after, by the way. Always clean. Another power tip, clean everything after you've finished, because this will stain. So I'm going to have a massive clean up at the end. But for now, we're coming in, getting that section sponged. Now, what I like to do with the edge of the sponge, work down the bead, clean it off, and then show the white in the plastic bead. Just give it a little pop. That's it. That's that section done. So that's it. Well done. Well, there's the rules you need to follow if you want to get into rendering for yourself, whether you're a beginner or if you're just someone who wants to up the game. If you want to learn the full process to rendering, where we'll show you everything including the scratch coat, the mix, how to get it on the wall, flattening like a pro, then watch this video here. That'll show you everything you need to know, and like and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Thanks a lot for watching, we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.